So it's not exactly a fair fight, and it's actually not the side you'd expect that's losing. This is exactly the kind of comparison that gets flattened into a headline and loses everything that actually matters. Understand what we're comparing here before anything else. On one side, the United States just announced a new class of warship expected to cost billions of dollars per hull and take years to reach the water. On the other side, a Chinese shipyard just put a converted cargo ship on public display. 60 containerized missile launch cells welded to the deck, built for a fraction of that cost in a fraction of that time. Same basic goal, strike capability at sea. Completely different price tag, completely different timeline. By the end of this video, I'm going to give you my verdict on who's actually winning that trade, and I don't think the answer is the one most people assume. If you're new here, take a second and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because this channel breaks down exactly this kind of comparison every week. The stuff that never makes it into a headline but decides who actually has the advantage at sea. I've spent years working commercial vessels and doing maritime security analysis, and comparisons like this one are where the real story usually lives. Where are you watching this from? Naval spending decisions, like the ones we're about to break down, affect trade routes and defense postures well beyond just the US and China, so tell me your country down in the comments. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because you need both sides of the comparison laid out clearly before any verdict makes sense. Start with the Chinese side. A shipyard on the Shanghai waterfront displayed a converted cargo vessel called the Zhongchuan, 97 meters long, tracked since 2024, operating so far only inside Chinese coastal waters. Her transponder was live and current when the images circulated, meaning this was a deliberate public display, not a leak. On deck sit rows of standard 40-foot containers, each holding 4 vertical launch tubes, 5 containers across, 3 rows deep, adding up to roughly 60 launch cells. Behind that sits a deck house with phased array radar. Forward of it, 2 close-in weapon systems for shooting down incoming threats, plus chaff launchers and what look like inflatable surface decoys designed to broadcast false radar signatures once deployed. Now, the American side. The US Navy has announced 2 major new shipbuilding programs recently. The first is a new large warship class, essentially a modern revival of a strike cruiser concept that has floated around naval planning circles since the 1980s, intended to eventually replace the aging Ticonderoga-class cruisers. It is an enormous platform with a huge range of intended capability. Missile systems, lasers, railguns, much of it still unproven at sea, and reporting on the program puts the cost at billions of dollars per hull, with a build timeline stretching years before the first ship is even operational. The second American program is a planned frigate replacement based on a variant of the Coast Guard's National Security Cutter, an offshore patrol vessel design rather than a true combat frigate, even though a combat-capable version with vertical launch cells does exist on paper. Even that more modest ship is expected to take around 2 years just to outfit for additional container-based capability under discussion. Let's also be precise about what each side is actually optimizing for, because the 2 programs aren't just different in cost, they're aimed at different problems entirely. The American Strike Cruiser program is designed around surviving and winning a direct, high-intensity engagement against a peer navy, which is why it's loaded with layered air defense, electronic warfare, and eventually directed energy weapons. The Chinese converted cargo ship program is not designed to win that kind of engagement at all. It's designed to be present in large numbers, cheaply, in places an adversary has to account for, and to deliver a first strike before anyone gets the chance to treat it as a legitimate target. Comparing them purely on cost per hull actually understates how different their intended jobs are, and that difference in intended job is exactly why a straight price comparison, while useful, doesn't tell the whole story on its own. Here's the thing about laying it out that way. It already tells you something before we even get to strategy. One side is building a small number of extremely expensive, extremely capable platforms over a multi-year timeline. The other side is converting existing commercial hulls for a few $1,000,000 each, in a fraction of the time, using a shipbuilding base that dwarfs everyone else's. A slide released by the United States Office of Naval Intelligence, now widely cited in defense reporting, put China's total shipbuilding capacity at roughly 200 times that of the United States. As of 2024, China was already responsible for slightly more than half of all commercial ships built worldwide, and order books for 2025 show it holding more than 60% of new global ship orders. That capacity gap is the entire reason this comparison exists in the first place. One more detail on the Chinese ship worth mentioning before we move to strategy. Observers online noticed a set of large canisters on deck and guessed they were life rafts. I don't think that's right. They're too large for standard life rafts given the size of crew a ship like this would carry. My read is that these are surface decoys, inflatable units meant to deploy and broadcast a false radar signature, so they register as additional vessels on somebody's screen. If that's accurate, the ship isn't just armed, it's built to multiply confusion around itself, which matters a lot once you start thinking about this in terms of a whole fleet rather than one hull. Let's get into the hardware difference for a minute, because cost alone doesn't tell you which approach actually wins. A standard vertical launch cell on an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer holds one large missile per tube, generally something built for long-range strikes or major air defense interceptors. What China is using on the Zhongchuan 79 is a containerized version, smaller and shorter ranged, 4 tubes packed into a single 40-foot box. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser carries roughly 122 launch cells for comparison, more than double what this converted cargo ship carries. So per hull, the American warship wins on raw capability every time. But the American warship also needs a trained crew in the low hundreds to operate, maintain, and fight it. While a converted merchant hull needs a fraction of that crew, because you are not asking it to maneuver in combat, you are asking it to sit, launch, and either survive or not. That crew and cost difference changes the entire equation once you start thinking in terms of numbers rather than single hulls. For the price and timeline of one advanced American warship, China could field a large number of converted cargo ships carrying a meaningful fraction of the missile capacity, spread across many more physical hulls in many more locations at once. You could put a dozen of these ships off Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, or anywhere else along a contested sea lane. And even though each individual ship carries less firepower than a single American cruiser, the combined total across a dozen hulls adds up fast. 10 of these ships alone gets you to roughly 600 launch cells collectively, more than 4 times what a single Ticonderoga-class cruiser carries, distributed across 10 different hulls instead of concentrated in one. It's worth naming who actually feels this comparison first if things ever escalate, because it isn't only naval planners. Every commercial shipping company, every port operator, and every insurer covering vessels in the Pacific now has to price in the possibility that an ordinary-looking cargo ship might not be ordinary at all. That's a cost that shows up quietly in shipping insurance rates and port security budgets long before any missile is ever launched. And it's a cost the American side of this comparison doesn't really impose on anyone in the same way. Since nobody looks at a US cruiser sailing past and wonders if it's secretly a disguised cargo vessel. Let me stop here and ask you something, because this is exactly where the debate should split people. Is quality still the right way to think about naval power in this scenario? One exquisite platform that can outfight almost anything one-on-one? Or does quantity actually win once you're talking about a fleet distributed across dozens of ordinary-looking hulls that are individually expendable? Hold that thought, because it's basically the entire question this video is trying to answer. Let's push on that question a little further, because it maps onto a real, decades-old debate inside American naval planning that rarely gets discussed outside defense circles. Naval strategists have argued for years over whether the future favors a smaller number of extremely capable, extremely expensive platforms, or a larger number of cheaper, more distributed ones that are individually easier to lose, but collectively harder to defeat. The US shipbuilding programs we just walked through are a direct product of the first school of thought. China's converted merchant cruiser approach is a direct product of the second. Neither school is objectively wrong in the abstract. What matters here is which one a given country can actually afford to execute at scale. And that's where China's shipbuilding capacity tips the balance in a way that raw doctrine on paper cannot. Now let's talk about why the US ended up on the expensive side of this comparison in the first place. Because it's not simply a matter of American engineers choosing complexity for its own sake. The United States does not have anywhere near the depth of merchant marine tonnage that China has to draw from, and manning converted vessels would pull crews and hulls away from strategic sea lift missions the country still needs for actual logistics. You could pull ships from the ready reserve force and attempt something similar to what China has done, but every ship converted that way is a ship no longer available to move cargo, fuel, or equipment somewhere else. China does not face that same trade-off at anywhere near the same scale, because its commercial shipbuilding and merchant fleet capacity so dramatically outsizes its immediate logistics needs that converting a portion of it barely registers as a loss. There's also a deeper structural reason behind the American approach, and it goes back further than this specific shipbuilding cycle. You have to go back to the British Navy in the 19th and early 20th centuries to find a comparable level of fusion between commercial shipping and national military planning. Britain needed cruisers to patrol its sea lanes during the First World War and did not have enough of them. So it took merchant vessels, mounted guns, swapped crews, and sent them out as what were called armed merchant cruisers, openly registered and publicly known as such. A related idea, the commerce raider, goes back even further to Civil War-era ships like the Alabama and the Shenandoah, and Germany fielded roughly a dozen of them again in World War II, hunting lone merchant vessels rather than confronting escorted convoys. Both approaches faded once convoy escort systems became standard, because a lone raider or converted cruiser stopped finding easy targets. The United States never built anything comparable to that integration model, and it still hasn't. The closest equivalent is the Military Sealift Command, essentially the government's own dedicated merchant marine, but true integration of the private commercial merchant fleet into military operations never took hold in any meaningful way, largely because the more military capability you build into a commercial hull, the less commercially viable that hull becomes to operate day to day. China gets around that trade-off by subsidizing its commercial merchant marine heavily, keeping companies like COSCO, the largest shipping line in the world across containers, heavy lift cargo, bulk carriers, and tankers, both commercially active and quietly available for state use. Every vessel of any real size flying the Chinese flag carries a political officer on board, a detail that tells you the separation between commercial shipping and state interest was never intended to be a hard line in the Chinese system. China has also pushed this same logic into other commercial ship types beyond cargo vessels, which strengthens the number side of this comparison even further. Reporting from War on the Rocks has detailed how China has built a class of civilian coastal ferries with direct military application already engineered into the design, including the capacity to carry tanks and heavy vehicles, alongside specialized landing barges that let those ferries tie up and bridge together for rapid over-the-beach unloading. China has also adapted select heavy-lift ships, normally used to transport other ships and large port cranes, into auxiliary helicopter platforms when the situation calls for it. None of that shows up in a direct cost comparison between one warship and one cargo ship, but it tells you the entire Chinese approach to naval expansion runs on the same underlying principle. Take a cheap commercial hull, give it a second military function, and multiply that across as many hulls as the shipbuilding base allows. China is not alone in the idea of hiding weapons inside ordinary commercial equipment, and it's worth being clear about that, so this doesn't sound like some uniquely Chinese trick nobody else has thought of. The United States Army has fielded a counter-drone system that pops directly out of a standard shipping container. Reporting around a presidential visit to Fort Bragg noted unusual guided rocket launchers positioned nearby inside shipping containers during the event. Ukraine's long-range drone strikes deep into Russian territory earlier this year relied in part on drones launched from modified truck trailers, a related idea applied on land instead of at sea. The concept itself is proven and repeatable everywhere. What separates China's version from all of these examples is scale, because nobody else has the commercial shipbuilding base or the merchant fleet size needed to turn a clever trick into a standing auxiliary force, numbering potentially in the dozens or hundreds of hulls. Let's be fair to the American side of this argument too, because the comparison isn't a simple story of good design versus bad design. A single American destroyer or cruiser is built to survive damage absorb a hit, and keep fighting in ways a converted cargo ship simply cannot. Most ships throughout history, regardless of size, tend to get mission killed by a single serious hit rather than surviving repeated damage. But a purpose-built warship still has armor, damage control systems, and redundancy that a converted merchant hull does not. If you strip away everything except a straight one-on-one fight, the American warship wins essentially every time. The entire argument for the Chinese approach is not that any single converted ship is better. It's that you never have to fight this on a one-on-one basis if you can field enough hulls simultaneously across enough locations that the American side cannot concentrate. It's more capable, but far more limited number of platforms fast enough to matter. Let's also put a number on what quality actually buys the American side, because it's real and it shouldn't get lost in this comparison. A modern American cruiser carries integrated air defense, sonar, electronic warfare systems, and a level of damage control redundancy that lets it absorb hits and keep functioning that a converted cargo ship simply was never engineered for. In a genuine one-on-one naval engagement, none of the Chinese converted hulls stand a real chance against a fully worked-up American cruiser or destroyer. The entire Chinese bet is that a one-on-one engagement is the wrong frame to use in the first place, and that the value of these ships comes from numbers and positioning rather than individual toughness. There's a timing angle worth adding here too. The American cruiser program and the frigate replacement program are both still years away from delivering their first operational hull. The Chinese converted cargo ship is sitting at a pier right now, fully built, fully equipped, and photographed doing it. Whatever the long-term merits of either strategy turn out to be, one side has a fielded capability today, and the other side has a set of contracts and a construction schedule. In any comparison of who's currently ahead, that timing gap matters as much as the eventual capability gap, because a superior ship that doesn't exist yet provides zero deterrence value in the meantime. There's a scenario worth walking through concretely, because abstract numbers are easier to argue about than a specific picture. Imagine 10 of these converted cargo ships positioned around a single target area, say Pearl Harbor, Joint Base Hickam, or a facility in the Philippines. At 60 launch cells each, that's roughly 600 inbound missiles available from platforms that look like nothing more than ordinary cargo traffic on radar and on the water. You could sink them once they're empty. Nobody disputes that. But the first strike already happened by the time anyone makes that call. And that's the entire value proposition behind the cheap side of this comparison. The expensive American cruiser in that same scenario is one platform in one place, and it cannot be everywhere the converted fleet chooses to show up. There's also the detection problem sitting underneath this entire numbers argument, and it's a piece most people comparing these two programs on cost alone tend to skip. Even if China only converts a small fraction of its merchant fleet the way it converted this one cargo ship, those ships look like ordinary commercial traffic until the moment they're activated, and that creates an enormous problem for anyone trying to track them. Go check marine traffic yourself and look at how packed a major global sea lane already is on any given day. Finding a handful of converted hulls hiding inside that traffic, especially before they do anything, is a genuinely hard analytical problem, even with satellite coverage, radar tracking, and artificial intelligence sorting through the data. We already see a milder version of this with the so-called dark fleet, the sanctioned tankers running without transponders to dodge oil sanctions. A converted merchant cruiser is arguably a harder case than a dark fleet tanker, because it doesn't need to hide at all. It can transmit its position normally, look completely ordinary, and still be carrying 60 missile launch cells nobody outside the crew knows about until it matters. That detection asymmetry is part of what China is buying with its shipbuilding advantage, on top of the raw cost and timeline savings. Put all of that together, the cost gap, the timeline gap, the crew requirement gap, and the detection asymmetry, and you start to see why this comparison isn't really close once you stop judging it purely on which single ship looks more impressive in a photograph. That's really the core of the verdict I promised you at the top. In my opinion, as someone who has spent years around commercial and military vessels, The side winning this specific trade right now is China, and it's not close. Not because their ships are individually better, they are not, but because the entire model is built around speed of fielding and sheer number of hulls, both of which flow directly from a shipbuilding capacity the United States currently has no path to matching in the near term. A billion-dollar warship that takes years to build represents years of engineering risk concentrated into a single hull. If that hull is delayed, damaged, or simply late, the country loses a meaningful fraction of its planned combat power for that entire period. A fleet of cheap converted merchant vessels spreads that same risk across dozens of hulls instead of one, and losing a single converted cargo ship is a real loss, but it does not set back an entire shipbuilding program the way losing one advanced cruiser would. It's worth being specific about what closing this gap would actually require on the American side, because the honest answer is uncomfortable. It is not simply a matter of Congress approving more funding for shipyards, although that's part of it. It would require the kind of state-directed coordination between commercial shipbuilders and military planners that the American system has spent decades deliberately avoiding, because that level of coordination looks a lot like the state control over private industry that the US has generally treated as something to compete against rather than imitate. Matching China on these terms isn't primarily a budget problem. It's a structural one, and structural problems take far longer to fix than a single new shipbuilding contract. I want to be fair to the counter-argument here too, because it deserves a real hearing, rather than a dismissal. Skeptics will point out that quality still matters enormously in a real engagement, that a fleet of cheap converted cargo ships gets picked apart quickly once actual combat starts, and that China displaying this ship in broad daylight, transponder active, weapons visible, suggests more of a messaging exercise than a genuine operational shift. That's a fair point, and I don't think it's wrong exactly. I think it's incomplete. The demonstration itself is part of the strategy. You don't need every converted hull to survive a real engagement if the actual value is forcing every American base commander in the Pacific to start treating ordinary cargo ships as a potential threat, which is expensive and time-consuming to defend against, regardless of whether China ever builds a second one of these ships. So here's where I land, and here's the question I want you to actually argue with me about. Should the United States try to match China's approach directly, subsidizing commercial shipbuilding and pushing toward the same kind of cheap, mass-produced auxiliary fleet, even though that would mean walking back decades of doctrine built around fewer, more capable, more expensive platforms? Or is the smarter move to accept that this is one race the US will not win on China's terms, and instead double down on the quality advantage of platforms like the new warship program, betting that raw capability per hull still wins if it ever actually comes to a fight? Billions versus millions. Tell me who you think actually wins that trade, and tell me why, because I want the disagreement in the comments on this one. That's it for this episode. Until next time, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, drop a comment, and share this with somebody who still thinks naval power is only about which ship looks more impressive. If you want to support the channel directly, the Super Thanks button is right below, or you can find me on Patreon. Until the next episode.